In this video, I'm going to do a bit of social commentary on the future of vehicles as it relates to electrification. There's a lot of talk about the how and why of where we need to go versus asking the questions of how do we actually get there to make it work. But let's get started. Now I'm going to break this video down into several sections so it's easier to follow and you don't have to stare at my face the entire time. With the proliferation of electrification in vehicles, we've been able to drive a whole myriad of cars and trucks. From standard hybrids that we've seen from Toyota and Honda for a long time. These cars are made to be on the road for 15 to 20 years in some cases. Then we have the performance hybrids where they're adding electric motors and e-axles, and of course plug-in hybrids, which are designed to kind of bridge the gap between full EVs and then full electric cars that need to be tied to the grid to keep it going. So the thing is, with all this new technology, people are worried and they're namely looking at the price tag when you have to shell out enough money or a lease payment that is like a small mortgage. I don't think people are that comfortable unless you have some disposable income to be a guinea pig or that first generation early adopter on technology that may not be around. And you have some of the EV companies that are falling off the map now, and those that are also still in existence definitely need cash infusions or some partnerships to keep going. So as a consumer, it's very worrying. Do you want to put your dollars and your life on the line on a product that you don't know if it's going to be around? And all of this I get. So here's the few things that I've started to learn talking with very, very talented people from multiple brands about this. You have the Toyota idea and some of the Honda idea that, you know, we can just keep the normal cars going with internal combustion, augmenting internal combustion with a small electric motor and a small battery pack that adds cost, but not something that's going to decimate someone's bank account. So you still get the better fuel efficiency, you're meeting all the new regulations, you're meeting the emissions targets, and you're not having to completely reinvent the wheel of making a brand new car from the ground up that has to live on the grid. So that's why hybrids have become more popularized in this economy. The other part is the plug-in electric hybrids kind of bridge that gap, but it definitely raises the cost. It raises the cost because you're essentially putting two different drivetrains in a car. You have a gasoline engine, and now you have a full electric drivetrain with a bigger battery pack, bigger electric motors to keep these things going. And when something goes wrong, you're basically repairing two cars, and you don't have a ground-up EV architecture either, so you still have the compromises of the older cars with modern technology. Then you get to the performance versions of these cars where now you have like the new 911 where you're getting this e-power with a traditional internal combustion engine, and it's just all there for performance. You're just going faster. You're having more power, and you're having the ability to have some of the EV perks like some regen, not a ton of extra added weight, or something like an E-Ray where you're adding all-wheel drive to the front axle to pull you out and give you more thrust for a limited amount of time. So again, there's really creative ways to do all this. Then it really gets down to the battery electric vehicle, and you have two extreme ends right now. You have something like GM did with the Hummer, where you take the maximum size battery pack. We're talking a double stacked, a double decker of meat, and over 200 kilowatt hour battery pack that can take up to almost 20 hours on a home charger at 240 volts. You know, and this is kind of the extreme way of like, okay, we have all this technology, look how big we can make our batteries, but it's the least efficient idea. But again, they're trying to approach it of popularizing the EV as not a dirty word, and look at all the stuff you can do off-roading. It's kind of like the Cybertruck mentality, just less efficient. And then you go to some other brands who are living and breathing efficiency, like Lucid. Their target is like, they want that magic 6 kilowatt hour type driving experience. And you know, they're not there yet, but their ultimate goal is efficiency, and that takes a lot of money to build a car from the ground up to do that. So, you know, there's all these different approaches. There's not one that's right, but again, it's about trying to find your market and what the consumer actually wants. Now we have to talk about the reason why there's not mass adoption in many countries. and this is the fine print of electric cars, and it's an absolute thorn in the side of many manufacturers, big and small, that have invested billions of dollars in creating an EV. And it goes down to the fact that people don't like to be forced into a technology that is not proven to them yet. And I'm just going to explain it this way. I'm a Zennial. I grew up during all the format wars. I saw VHS versus Beta, PC versus Mac. I saw all of the formats that fell by the wayside in consumer electronics and things that were dreamt up and promised to be the next big thing. People wasted money and they disappeared. And the difference between that and spending a couple $100s versus spending $50,000 to $70,000 on an electric car is it's now a mortgage payment to have a vehicle, right? People are not willing to just throw their livelihood in retirement just because something's cool and a promise of a green future or a better driving. And then you have regulatory bodies forcing technology that's not 100% ready to come out or have mass adoption. You get what we have right now. And that is people that have come flat out rejected it, flat out have turned it into a political issue, and they don't want anything to do with it. And now you're back into this format war with people. And it's the worst situation possible. And a lot of this boils down to the regulators and the people that are making some of these decisions don't understand how things work. So let's talk about that briefly. To get an electric car in somebody's hands, they need to have a couple things. One, money. Two, they need to have home charging. You absolutely have to have it in this era. And to install a home charger is not possible in every home. If you're in a rental home, that could be sticky. If you're in a situation where you don't have an updated panel for service, where you can't supply the power output, that means it has to be rewired, which is very expensive. If you need an electric charger that's nowhere near that service panel, it's going to be way more expensive to install, and we're talking over $2,000, and I've experienced this already twice. So you need to get chargers in people's homes for almost nothing, right? Very, very affordably, and you need more electricians that are going to do this where you're not having to screw around. And we're talking about, if you want millions of cars on the road, that has to be solved. The second thing is public charging infrastructure. And we're not talking about leasing out Tesla superchargers to brands. We're talking about government subsidized charging infrastructure where you have regulated rates on energy delivery. That means I go to a charger and I'm not guessing what the rate is. If I'm going 10 miles away or in the middle of nowhere, I don't want to be surprised that I'm filling up my Hummer full of electricity and it's now $200 versus, $4,500 or $45 somewhere else. And the other part is there is a lot of electric chargers, and Hyundai and Kia will tell you this. They're like, hey, take a look at all the chargers. It should be no problem. And then, okay, sounds like there's a lot. And then you get out there and then you realize that, well, they don't work, or they're not delivering the advertised speed, which is even more frustrating, because if you have to get somewhere and you've planned your charging around the fact that you might only have 30 miles range and you get to a charger and it doesn't work, or you have 5 Chevy Bolt owners from like 8 years ago sitting there for 45, 50 minutes, you're going to be very, very frustrated. And I think these are just the common sense basic things you need to do and to solidify and fix before you start forcing or even talking about the future of formats for people in terms of driving. And if you had these problems solved, I can tell you unequivocally, I'm driving a Lucid Air, a long-term Lucid Air, and I've driven multiple iterations of this car, from the earlier 21 to the 2022 and now the 24. And the 24 has had basically all the updates you can imagine that have fixed a majority of the first generation problems. I would prefer to be in that car 95% of my commute, not only from performance, handling, comfort, technology, than almost any other car on the road. I would say that I'm almost converted, but for almost 95% of the public, that car's not going to work for them, as great as it is. And this becomes, again, how do we reverse this process and kind of go back to the drawing board of getting the government and the regulators to understand these things, which is going to be the third segment of this video. The next area of discussion is the regulatory bodies or government. And when you discuss cars and politics, there's nothing more divisive. Most businesses, most car companies operate for a singular purpose, and that is to manufacture money. Now, of course, there's ego involved and a whole bunch of different layers to it, but really at the end of the day, governments have stepped in large part around the world to make decisions on what's best for their own societies based on their cultural beliefs, right? So what Sweden or Switzerland is doing is not the same as the United States. The US is not Germany. The Germany is not the UK, right? It goes back to the fundamentals of relationships. If you're with somebody and you tell them you need to do this, 9 out of 10 times they're not going to listen to you. You can't change people. You can only change yourself and what you believe, and then hopefully work with the other person to find a compromise. And a lot of this, you're going to do this mentality that's gone on in government and regulation, not just with people, but with business, is a slippery slope. And the whole scale of economy and selling cars and the future of cars it's a cautionary tale of be careful what you wish for. Because for a long time, and we're not just talking about one generation of people, I'm not isolating out a certain age group or demographic or political ideology. I'm talking about for 20, 30 years, we've been, or even longer, we've been moving towards this place of like, how do we make more money? And a lot of times in manufacturing, at least in the automotive and tech space, it's, well, we make more money by reducing overhead. And that means moving manufacturing to more affordable situations. When we've seen it moving overseas to Mexico where there's subsidies, cheap labor. I mean, I work for a company that farmed out labor to Mexico. I know all about it. And I understand that it's a blessing and a curse because you can drive down prices for the consumer, you get more competitive, but when it backfires, when it's no longer cheap and your product is now just as expensive as it was before, there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to get things to be more affordable. And that's kind of the situation we're at. And when you talk about electric cars specifically, in the United States, you're pushing for electric cars. And now you have an enormous country trying to manufacture electric cars subsidized for absolutely pennies on the dollar. And in our economy where people are suffering because they can't afford cars and products and durable goods and food and all that stuff, when prices are going up, people jump at the chance to have a $15,000 car from China. They don't care where it's from. They don't care how it's made, what information they're harvesting from you, software, security, all of that. They just want something they can get from point A to point B. And this is where it's becoming a dangerous situation because, you know, at some point you have to put the brakes on and realize you can't just get rid of every single job. You can't send everything out to make it cheaper. You have to figure out a way to make it work in your own country to survive. And that's why we're seeing this big debate against, well, do we tariff other countries and their cars? Is it really free economy if you don't allow that in? Again, it depends on who you're talking to. But one thing I will say is if, like anything, you bring in something at a lower cost and you can't compete locally, that goes out of business. And it just depends on how much you value your local economy and workforce and how much you're willing to sacrifice. And again, that's why I kind of started this by saying, careful what you wish for. Now, the last topic is going to be the internal combustion engine. And I'm going to preface this by saying you could throw 10 people in a room and you'd be absolutely lucky that everybody got along, let alone agreed on the same topic. And, you know, you times that by a global population, there's no way we're all going to be on the same page for everything. And when it comes to like regulating cars, I think this is where it becomes even more tricky. And regulating the internal combustion engine is nothing new. We had fuel economy standards, we have emission standards. Clearly, we don't want to be walking around in toxic air, rolling coal. I think if it was up to some of us, we'd be driving around in V12 cars that got 2 miles to the gallon and you could hear them 16 miles away. Well, others just don't care about that stuff. You know, you need to have some types of rules for the greater good of people, and I understand it. But here's the thing. The internal combustion engine is old, right? We've had it forever. And we reached the peak of reliability and some of the performance where things weren't crazy mechanically and electronically controlled. But now everything has to be. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're accelerating development. The requirements to get the tailpipe emissions clean You know, Porsche joked around with us saying that, you know, they're basically running a giant air filtration unit on the exhaust system to try to get the air out cleaner than it came in. And all of these things have an effect on the cost of development and engineering to make these systems work in a way they weren't necessarily designed to. In the case of brands that don't have as much budget, they're desperately trying to figure out how to come up with cleaner technology for their internal combustion engines so they can continue selling cars. And the problem with doing a lot of this is that it's not particularly tested. And who's buying it? The consumer. And now that cars are so expensive, you're stuck with that for a long period of time. It's not like you can just buy a $40,000 car and flip it in 2 years. It just doesn't work that way. So while the numbers show that people are keeping their cars longer, it's by necessity, right? You can't get out of it. And if these technologies are not working and they're very difficult to repair, get parts for, everything's more expensive, we know that. How is this better for people overall if they can't afford to keep a car or they just flip it and lease it all the time? You're defeating the whole purpose of trying to make things more efficient if you've created a throwaway economy of cars. And I'm not saying every car is throwaway, but you're seeing far and far more quality issues in terms of manufacturing. These modern engines, transmissions, and now you're adding battery packs and electric motors to these cars to boost it. You're also developing eco oils like 0W8. It's a way to sneak out an extra mile per gallon, but that's a type of oil that doesn't hold up to the heat as well. You know, there's all these compromises that they're trying to do. And I think the most confusing part is also the safety standards. That needle keeps moving. So you're creating safety standards on brands where they have to meet a certain requirement of crash testing, right? Like they have to be safe, which makes sense. But yet there's no regulation on things like this, where you have a 10,000 pound tank that's going to crash in anything and you're going to kill somebody. So how do you protect people against something like this? Well, you take a regular car and you have to add another 500, 600, 700 pounds of weight to protect somebody. So then there goes your fuel efficiency gains, because now the car is way more heavy and it's not getting the fuel economy numbers. You know, it's this endless loop of broken ideas and broken policies to make things work. And what you do is you have this convoluted system for people that's really difficult to understand, worse products in many cases, and now you're trying to make the EV the savior of all these bad decisions. and if you're a company trying to run an EV brand or sell EVs, I completely envy you. I've got to the place of like, now people actually just actively hate you because you've become the reason why regular cars are more expensive and difficult to manufacture. And again, it's about being more tempered about your approach of realizing, look, we can't do this all at once. How do we do it in a smart way to get people excited for it without ruining the past vehicles as well? And I think you have a compromised first generation product for most EVs that aren't the greatest yet. And you have a compromised latest generation of internal combustion cars that are way too expensive, overcomplicated, and just overbearing in terms of technology to try to sell them. And you're in a weird era of cars. And I think it's going to take some really smart people to understand this and connect with the actual people that are buying these and stuck with them to kind of roll back some of these plans and think about, like, how do we do this right? Shouldn't we be spending our money to make it easier for people to adopt these and get them excited for it? And also not trying to jam it down people's throats that aren't ready for it, or regions that may never be ready for it, and being honest about that. That's personally where this should be going. And I think it's going to take some smart people to get in there, to educate people, to get into even government, right? Like running for local or, federal government in many, many countries to start to make these changes, to adjust them. And you can go down the multiple layers and you create a friendlier environment where people are going to be excited again to potentially own cars or products. I'll be curious to see what you say. I'd be curious to see what your opinion is on these topics, and I know it's extensive, but I really appreciate you watching. See you next video.